The day the rig showed up, I was knee-deep in kale. It was one of those clear, dry Texas mornings that make the earth seem ancient and invincible. I'd just finished watering the last row of my kale garden, tucked on the southern edge of my ranch, 6 acres of tilled glory I'd built myself over the last 8 years. A row of heritage tomatoes ran perpendicular to the kale, and beyond that, the land sloped gently downward to a fence I installed myself, with signs every 20 feet, private property, no trespassing, district water access below. It was not decorative. I'm Travis Wendell. I'm 44. I live alone, by choice, on 75 acres that have been in my family for 3 generations. My wife passed 4 years ago, and my therapy became dirt, rows and rows of food for the farmer's market, donated boxes to the church pantry, and small batches I shipped to a few vegan cafes in Austin. I kept things simple, legal, and entirely mine. Which is why the sound of diesel engines grinding across the east ridge of my property that Tuesday morning made the hairs on my arms stand up. I didn't go charging up the hill. I didn't yell. I didn't grab my shotgun like some might assume. No, I set down my watering can and walked, quietly, steadily, to the property line, where a giant auger drill was being prepped beside 3 folding chairs, a red cooler, and a woman in a sun hat sipping what looked like iced tea. Her name was Karen, but the locals knew her better as HOA Karen. She turned to me as casually as if I were a delivery driver. "Morning. We're just going to be out of your way in no time. We got approval from the board for a community well. It's really the best spot." She gestured at my kale. I blinked. "That's my land." She smiled. "Oh no, dear. That's the community access corridor. It was part of the Ridgeway Village easement agreement back in 2009. It's public utility space. Technically." She said the last word like it gave her a legal shield. I knew the clause she was talking about. Only it didn't apply here. Ridgeway Village's easement ran along the northern boundary, nowhere near my southern acreage. But Karen wasn't the kind of woman who asked questions. She was the kind who bulldozed first and cited bylaws later. That's when I saw the city inspector walking around with a clipboard. Hard hat. Safety vest. Clipboard shaking in his hand. "Sir," he said when I approached, "are you the landowner?" "Yes," I said, "and you're trespassing." That fence was the warning. Karen butted in. "He's confused. He's not part of the HOA. He's just a neighbor. Technically adjacent." The inspector pulled out a map. "Wrong parcel. Wrong permit. Wrong everything." I asked him plainly, "Did you check the underground utility map?" He hesitated. "I wasn't instructed to." I nodded once, slowly. "That's a federal water main under this field. You drill here, and you won't be irrigating flower beds, you'll be flooding 3 counties and setting off an emergency alert system that calls in Homeland Security." Karen laughed. Actually laughed. "That's absurd. This is kale." Behind her, the drill roared to life. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just walked away. I went back to the house, picked up the phone, and made one call. Not to the sheriff. Not to a lawyer. To the Director of Municipal Infrastructure Enforcement for District 14. A man who owed me a favor for a land use review I testified at last year. I read him the parcel number. I gave him the GPS coordinates. His words were simple: tell them to shut it down or stand back. We're scrambling a response team. I watched from my porch as the drill started boring into the earth. And waited for the moment the ground would bite back. From my front porch, it looked almost peaceful. A light breeze ruffled the kale leaves. The drilling rig rumbled steadily, like a sleeping beast. Karen, unbothered as ever, reclined in her fold-out chair under a branded HOA umbrella, sipping something citrusy through a striped straw. It was the calm before the detonation. I glanced at the digital clock mounted above my kitchen window. 10:13 a.m. I knew what lay beneath that field, roughly 6 feet of clay, 3 feet of reinforced municipal housing, then the buried marvel that was Line 27A, a 42-inch high-pressure main carrying processed water from the regional treatment facility into the city's northern district. I knew because my grandfather helped dig it. The mistake wasn't just stupidity. It was catastrophic ignorance. Drilling into a federally protected line without clearance wasn't just trespass. It was criminal negligence. 10 minutes later, the sky opened up from the ground. I didn't see it first, I heard it. A metallic shriek as the drill hit reinforced housing. A half-second of silence. Then the earth groaned. Not a small tremor. Not a crack. A roar from below like something waking up angry. And then it erupted. A geyser of water exploded upward, 30 feet into the air, shredding the auger rig like it was made of aluminum foil. The blast twisted metal, sent folding chairs flying, and soaked Karen's precious HOA binder in a single, humiliating splash. She screamed, arms flailing, hat sailing off like a frisbee, as the pressure forced her backward into the mud. It was like watching nature spit back an insult. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I went inside and brewed coffee. Through the window, I could see the inspector shouting into a radio, now drenched and pale, trying to shield his face from the fountain of chaos he'd just helped unleash. A utility truck skidded to a stop near the road, men in neon gear jumping out with emergency shut-off kits, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Water, brown at first, then clearer, surged across the field, swamping the kale, rolling toward the eastern fencing like a small tsunami. Karen stumbled, face streaked with mud and mascara, screaming something about water contamination and personal assault by groundwater. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee, watching the show unfold. Then my landline rang. It was Roy Clemens, the director I'd called earlier. "Travis," he said, not even waiting for a greeting, "we're already on site. That's a level 4 breach." "What in the actual?" "They drilled without checking the map," I said simply. Son of a, I could hear him pacing. Did she really use a community HOA vote as her authority? She did. "And the land is yours?" "Every square inch." "And the permit?" There wasn't one. He exhaled so hard I could hear it over the line. This just became a federal incident. And if she's not smart enough to lawyer up in the next 20 minutes, she's going to be explaining her life decisions to the Department of the Interior. Outside, the water had begun to recede slightly as the emergency shutoff team reached the main valve chamber near the ridge. But the damage to the surface infrastructure was done. The rig was ruined. The kale was flattened. And Karen was now sitting, utterly soaked, in the bed of a pickup truck, surrounded by 3 county officials and 1 very unamused sheriff's deputy. I hung up with Roy and grabbed my folder. The one labeled Ridgeway HOA, clauses, easements, and violations. Because the water eruption was only the beginning. The real collapse hadn't even started yet. The storm passed. Not the literal one, the water was still draining across the eastern ridge, turning Karen's clipboard empire into a swamp of paperwork and crushed plastic chairs. No, I mean the chaos of sirens, the hiss of pressure release valves, the barking of orders. By noon, the geyser was sealed. And by 12:18 p.m., the collapse of Karen's kingdom had begun. It started quietly. No dramatic declarations. No courtroom drama. Just one man, Deputy Water Commissioner Harvey Sloan, squatting next to the drill site with a flashlight and a waterproof tablet, tapping notes while Karen paced in a dripping sundress 2 yards away, muttering about community initiative. I approached with the folder under my arm. Sloan stood up, squinted at me. "Mr. Wendell?" I nodded. "I have something you'll want to see." I handed him the folder, thick with laminated pages, color-coded tabs, and a signed affidavit from a surveyor dated just 3 weeks earlier. He opened it, and within 10 seconds, he stopped talking altogether. "What is this?" he finally asked, thumbing through the documents. "Proof," I said, calm as stone. "That not only does Ridgeway HOA have no jurisdiction on my property, but the clause they cited to justify this drilling, Clause 14B of the Community Easement Overlay, was nullified by a revision in 2012. See tab 5. It's stamped and signed by the county land registrar. He flipped to the tab. Read. Whistled low. Then he turned toward Karen. She was too busy yelling into her phone to notice at first. Something about liability insurance. Then Sloan raised his voice, "Mrs. Myers." She froze. And for the first time since this debacle started, I saw her doubt herself. He held up the folder. "Did you or your board verify the updated status of this easement before initiating excavation on parcel #331B? She blinked. "It's community access land. It's always been marked as such." "Not since 2012, he said, voice clipped. "This document shows that the easement was dissolved due to non-use and failure to maintain community boundary permits. This parcel reverted entirely to Mr. Wendell's private domain over a decade ago." "That can't be right," she said, stepping forward. "We have it on our map." Sloan raised an eyebrow. "And where did your map come from?" Karen hesitated. He held up the folder again. "Because this came from the registrar's office. Yours probably came from a newsletter." Karen's mouth opened and closed, no words forming. Just blinks. The deputy sheriff, who'd been leaning against his cruiser with arms crossed, walked over. "Ma'am," he said, "we may need you to come down to the station. We're getting requests from the county office, and, well, they're not thrilled." Karen turned to me, desperate now. This was a misunderstanding. A bureaucratic misfire. "You could have just told us." "I did," I said, evenly. "I posted the warnings. I marked the boundary. You didn't ask. You assumed." Her face twisted. "You're not even part of the HOA. Why do you care?" I looked at her then, really looked at her, this woman who had built a paper-thin world on bylaws and bullying, who had pushed and pushed until the ground gave way beneath her. "I care," I said, "because you turned community into control. Because you tried to take something that wasn't yours and dress it up as civic duty. You drilled into a federal main line for a vanity project. And now, Karen, it's not just the dirt that's unraveling." A silence fell. Then the commissioner closed the folder and turned to the sheriff. "If you don't mind, Deputy, I'll be filing the initial report with the Office of Infrastructure Violations. She's going to need a lawyer." Karen didn't faint. But she did sit down in the mud. And as she buried her face in her trembling hands, I walked away, boots squelching in the soft, ruined kale. But I wasn't done. The hole she drilled wasn't just into my soil, it was into her own foundation. And I had more documents. More clauses. More skeletons from her HOA closet. By that evening, Ridgeway Village looked more like a crime scene than a neighborhood. Orange cones circled the collapsed drill site. A flood mitigation team had set up pumps to siphon off standing water from my once pristine kale rows. A drone buzzed overhead, capturing aerial footage for the insurance adjusters and, no doubt, the local news crew that showed up an hour later. Karen wasn't outside anymore. Her car was gone. Her clipboard empire abandoned at the edge of the road. But I wasn't going to let her slink off into silence. No, that night I opened a manila envelope that had been sitting in my file cabinet since the previous winter. Inside were minutes from Ridgeway HOA board meetings, anonymous letters from neighbors too scared to complain out loud, and financial records I had no business possessing, except they'd been emailed to me, anonymously, by a former board member who wanted to see her finally taken down a peg. Back then, I hadn't done anything with it. I didn't care. Karen was just a noise across the fence line. Annoying, but irrelevant. But after today? After trespassing, drilling, flooding, and smearing my name to utility agencies? It was time to flip the lights on and show the roaches. First, I printed copies of the HOA's 2022 financial reports and matched them with what Karen had publicly distributed in the newsletter. There were discrepancies. Entire budget lines that didn't match. Large payouts labeled special consultant fees that traced back to a company called Whitmore Solutions LLC, Karen's maiden name. A shell company. No website. No other clients. Then I looked at the grant for community beautification, a $27,000 fund that had supposedly gone toward planting new trees at the East Park entrance. Funny thing. No trees had ever been planted. But someone sure cashed the check. Next, I dug into a spreadsheet of violations Karen had levied against residents. The pattern was glaring. Her citations almost exclusively targeted newer homeowners, single men, or anyone who had publicly disagreed with her in an HOA meeting. Meanwhile, her friends, the founding circle as she called them, they could park RVs on their lawns for weeks, paint their shutters neon pink, and nobody batted an eye. I printed everything. Labeled it. Bound it in a thick white report labeled, Ridgeway HOA, a pattern of misuse and misconduct. Then I emailed it to 3 people. The County Compliance Board. The local journalist who had been on my porch earlier that afternoon. Every homeowner in Ridgeway Village. The subject line was simple. The hole Karen dug wasn't just in the ground. By morning, the neighborhood had exploded. People forwarded the email like wildfire. A neighbor named Marcy, who I'd only spoken to twice, replied with, "She fined me $500 for my wind chimes. This explains everything." Another man, George Lanning, replied with a scanned copy of his own citation, complete with photos Karen had clearly taken herself from his backyard. They were livid. By 10 a.m., a group of residents had gathered outside the HOA clubhouse with hand-lettered signs. "Karen doesn't speak for us, where's the beautification money?" And my favorite, "Don't drill where you don't belong." And then came the knock at my door. It was Sheriff Tully. Hat in hand. Polite, but serious. "She's filed a countersuit," he said. "Claiming defamation, harassment, and intentional interference with HOA duties." I stared at him for a long beat, then handed him the white binder. "Then I suggest she reads Exhibit F." He flipped it open. Paused. Chuckled. "Well, I'll be." Behind him, I could see HOA members still gathering. Some were holding their own copies of the email I sent. Others were recording with their phones. Word was out. Karen's grip had slipped. And I hadn't even touched the nuclear button yet. Because tucked inside the binder, behind the spreadsheets and scanned documents, was a photocopy of a very specific amendment to the Ridgeway HOA charter. One that Karen had apparently forgotten existed. It stated that if any president of the HOA was found to have misused over $10,000 in community funds, a mandatory emergency vote must be held within 72 hours to determine their continued fitness to lead. It was signed in 2014. By Karen herself. Karen didn't show her face for the rest of that day. Not when the Ridgeway Facebook group lit up like a bonfire. Not when neighbors started knocking on each other's doors with printed copies of the report. Not even when Channel 6 News ran a teaser about local HOA corruption linked to a water main explosion during the evening broadcast. But her name? Oh, it was everywhere. In the 24 hours following the email, her hold on Ridgeway Village slipped from iron grip to frantic grasp. The narrative had flipped. Suddenly, I wasn't the difficult neighbor anymore. I was the whistleblower. The rancher with the receipts. The guy who didn't yell when they trespassed, but waited until they made a federal mess and then calmly revealed they'd been standing on a paper throne. And Karen? She was no longer the queen. She was the storm. Angry. Loud. Spinning. The emergency vote was scheduled for Friday night, per the charter clause she herself had signed. 48 hours. One homeowner, one vote. Remote ballots allowed. No time for spin control. And that's when her loyalists tried to circle the wagons. Emails went out, desperate ones, claiming I'd doctored documents, that I had a personal vendetta because Karen once denied a permit for a greenhouse I never even applied for. Her right-hand man, Dennis Foster, posted a 10-paragraph rant about ungrateful landowners who don't understand the spirit of community. The comments under that post were brutal. Dennis, she fined me $150 for planting lavender. She took our landscaping budget and bought herself a Peloton. My driveway's been cracked for 2 years. Where's the repair fund? By the second day, the calls started. Travis, what's the process to join the HOA board? Do you have any more documents we should know about? Can we meet? We're forming a recall committee. I didn't want to be a hero. I didn't want the HOA crown. I just wanted to grow vegetables and be left alone. But Ridgeway had turned me into something else, a symbol that it was possible to push back. So, I did one more thing. I stood up at the community clubhouse on the night of the vote, wearing a clean shirt, holding nothing but a manila envelope. The place was packed. Some stood. Some sat. A few watched from the back through the open doors. Karen sat at the head table, arms folded, expression carved from marble. I stepped to the mic, cleared my throat. I'm not here to tell you how to vote, I began, but I am here to remind you what the HOA is supposed to be: service, not power. Fairness, not favoritism. And leadership, not intimidation dressed up in pastel binders. I held up the manila envelope. Inside this are copies of every expenditure over $500 made under Karen's presidency. Every dollar of missing funds, every violation that didn't go through proper procedure, every check signed by a consultant who doesn't exist. I paused. You deserve transparency. Not because I say so, but because your own charter demands it. Page 12, subsection G, Karen knows. She wrote it. The silence was thick. And then came the votes. They came in fast. Loud. Unanimous, almost. Some ballots were passed forward with tiny notes: "Thank you, sorry we didn't listen sooner, can you teach me how to grow kale?" And by the end of the hour, the results were clear. 71-3. Karen was removed from her position. Her face didn't move at first. But her hands did, grabbing her binder, her tote, her dignity by the edges. She stood, said nothing, and walked out without a glance to either side. Dennis tried to follow. Someone told him to sit down. No one stopped Karen from leaving. But the moment she stepped off the clubhouse steps, 3 people stood up and began applauding. Then more. Until the entire room echoed with clapping, not for me. Not really. But for the end of her reign. I didn't stick around much longer. I walked out into the night, the sound fading behind me, and headed back to my ranch. To my land. To my kale. It took almost a week for the dust to settle. Karen's removal didn't magically fix Ridgeway Village. The legal investigation into the waterline breach had just begun. Insurance claims were still being filed. And my kale garden, God rest its chlorophyll-rich soul, was a flattened, soggy mess. But something else had started growing. Not in the dirt. In the people. Neighbors I'd never spoken to stopped by with casseroles and tools and awkward, heartfelt thank yous. Marcy from Elm Street brought me zucchini bread and said she hadn't been able to hang a wind chime for 3 years without getting a citation. George Lanning arrived with a wheelbarrow and 2 teenage sons, asking if he could help replant the tomato rows. The boys need to know what real work looks like, he said. Even Dennis Foster, yes, that Dennis, showed up one morning in work gloves. He didn't say much, just nodded once and began scraping mud off the broken fencing near the drill site. We didn't speak a word for over an hour. But sometimes silence is louder than an apology. Karen had vanished. Her Lexus was gone. Her blinds drawn. Rumor had it she was visiting family out of state, though I suspected her attorney had told her to stay quiet. The HOA board had been completely restructured, more volunteers, more transparency, fewer clipboards. And me? I went back to my routine. Early mornings. Dew on the boots. Fresh seedling trays on the porch rail. But something was different. One morning, as I knelt to plant the first kale starters of the new season, I noticed something poking out of the dirt where the rig had once been. A glint of metal. I brushed it off carefully. It was a piece of the auger. Twisted. Bent. Blackened by the blast of pressure from the broken line. And there, near the base, was a ribbon, faded, soaked through, but still legible. It read, HOA Beautification Initiative, Ridgeway Strong. I chuckled. Not out of bitterness. Just irony. I kept the piece. Mounted it on a wooden plaque and hung it in the tool shed. A little reminder that control disguised as community has a shelf life. And about a month later, I received a letter in the mail. Not from Karen. Not from the HOA. From the District Water Authority. It was short and official, stating that due to the swift actions taken by a private citizen, that'd be me, a full-scale disaster had been avoided. As a gesture of goodwill and to acknowledge responsible land stewardship, they were offering a $25,000 infrastructure grant to help repair the damage. I used every cent to restore the garden. Raised beds this time. Better drainage. A small greenhouse in the back for winter crops. And a wooden sign I carved myself. Here grows what cannot be bulldozed. People still talk about that summer. About the explosion. The fall of Queen Karen. The binder empire that imploded under its own weight. But for me, the real story wasn't about revenge. Or even justice. It was about the moment when silence won. When I didn't shout. Didn't fight. Just watched. Waited. And let a single, buried clause bring down an entire kingdom. Because sometimes, the best way to deal with an HOA tyrant is to hand them a shovel and let them dig.